All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the sixth episode, I believe, of CRA Mondays. Today is June 23rd, and we're very fortunate today to welcome Pedro Demolder, who is who is an attorney, and who is going to give us a peek into how he thinks and works with his clients and give us a peek on how to understand the CRA from the perspective of a manufacturer that has to look at it as a compliance exercise. And I think this is going to be very, very helpful to help us better understand how manufacturers are going to look at open source and their open source supply chain and the role of open source and open source stewards in that regard. So very excited, very happy for Pedro to be able to join us today and to enlighten us on how, to some degree, the other side of this equation is looking at the same problem. Thank you very much for joining us, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So, as Toby already said, I'm an attorney. I have thought of a funny title for this presentation because it's actually quite relevant to see the CRA in its true scope. And we've seen that the CRA is a very broad piece of legislation, meaning that it applies to almost anything that processes data to a certain extent and then sends it out. And since today more and more products are becoming connected, the title might actually be the truth of fridge that is smart, that looks into what you have in your fridge, tells you what you need to buy, might be a relevant product with digital elements under the CRA. So today I won't go too deep into what the CRA is because I suppose that everyone has like already an understanding of what is written in the legislation, but I will go over some key concepts just to make sure that everyone is aligned, that we understand the legal definitions in the same way. As Toby already mentioned, the goal today is really to have a look at it from both the legal and business perspective, like the questions that a client would have if they come to us and then ask what should we do, because more and more we are getting questions, particularly on the scope of the CRA, where clients are asking us, does this apply to us? How does it apply to us? What do we have to do? All of this we'll quickly look at. So maybe just a little bit about me, some advertisement for myself. I took this very serious picture because I'm a very serious person in real life. I'm an IP and IT lawyer. I'm from the GDPR generation, meaning that I started with IT law because of the GDPR, specifically advising startups, and then moving on to more specializing into IT in general. Important here is that IT is becoming a very, very broad topic, legally speaking. We will see in a minute what I mean by that. Meaning that you also need to start specializing as a lawyer, and you can't do everything anymore. But you need to know a bit about everything to be able to work. So the things that I like most nowadays are data legislation, like for example, Data Act, but also cybersecurity, such as NIS2 and the CRA. So I'm also involved in the Crazy ECCC funded project, where I specifically look at how to help SMEs with compliance with the CRA. But specifically then from the legal perspective, we also have technical partners in there who look at it from the more technical side. And I've also been teaching a bit in cybersecurity and data law for the past 3 years in universities, but also at clients and conferences. So looking at what it means to be a IT lawyer today, you can see the nice waterfall that is made by the entity Bruegel, which makes a very nice overview. This one is already a bit dated. It's from 2023, I think, where you can see all the new legislation in IT. And all of this is important to have in mind when you look at the CRA, because of course the CRA is not just the piece of legislation, it's part of a bigger whole where you have interactions with other kinds of legislation. So we are specifically now looking at cybersecurity, but when you look at the CRA, you will also have, for example, potential overlaps with other legislation such as the AI Act, which is another type of product legislation, or you will have questions with regard to how does a CRA apply with respect to NIS2? Are there overlaps? Are there none? And then you have everything with regard to data, because of course, what cybersecurity will be doing will be protecting the data. So if we look at what cybersecurity is from a legal perspective, this all starts with the concept of protecting. It protects three things according to the law. First of all, network and information systems, then also the users who use such systems, and then finally also any other person affected by cyber threats. So cybersecurity is very broad, but it always starts from that network and information system that you are trying to protect. Cybersecurity legislation in the EU always falls apart into two big chunks of obligations. First of all, you have your pre-incident obligations, where you will be looking at how do you prepare for a cyber incident? Do you need to train your employees? Do you need to organize your business in a certain way? Oh, we have a comment. Yes, the sites will be distributed. Do you need to make specific development or manufacturing changes to your products, then specifically in the context of the CRA? Then you also have the post-incident requirements, where you look at what do I need to do after an incident happens. In practice, this is mainly a reporting obligation, but also how do you handle the vulnerabilities? From your practical point of view, this is of course all logical, but this is how lawyers will look at cybersecurity legislation. So if we then look specifically also at the scope of what is protected, you have the network and information systems. Network and information systems are three things. This definition comes from the NIS2 directive. It applies, first of all, to devices or groups of devices that perform automatic processing of data. It applies to the data itself, which is, of course, digitally processed because it's on a device, and also to the electronic communications networks. So it applies to the devices themselves, to the data on the devices, but also it applies to how this information is exchanged. So these three things are always protected. And then looking at it from the broader perspective of cybersecurity, it applies to the users, but also any other person affected by, for example, a cybersecurity incident. So this is how the legislator looks at cybersecurity. So then when the legislator looked around to the market, they saw that actually there were three big issues. You probably know this if you've read the CRA. It's in the very first part where they describe that there is a very low level of cybersecurity, very low level of understanding by the users, but also by the manufacturers, and also that there is an exponential growth of devices. So all this taken together presents, of course, a significant risk, where the European Commission decided we need a regulation. So we put like a baseline. The regulation means that it's applicable immediately. There is no need for a transposition on the national level, like you have, for example, for NIS2. It needs to be horizontal. Horizontal means it applies to any sector. So we don't look at specific sectors like you would have, for example, with DORA, where you look at the financial sector. It's technology neutral, so it's irrespective of technology. We just look at what it does, and then specifically in the CRA, that will be data processing. And then they impose on those products essential cybersecurity requirements. So essential means minimum. You can go beyond, but it's the minimum requirement that is needed to place products on the market. And then those requirements are applied to products with digital elements. And at the core of this is, of course, the product with digital elements, which is what the material scope of the CRA decides. But the CRA is a special one because it's a mix. It's not just cybersecurity legislation, it's also product legislation. Cybersecurity legislation, as we saw earlier, means you have your pre-incident obligations, you have your post-incident obligations, and that's what you would have, for example, under an AS2. But the CRA applies specifically to products with digital elements, applying minimum requirements to them, meaning that you will also have the additional obligations of, for example, doing the conformity assessments, applying your CE marking, etc. And only when you have applied those minimum requirements, you will be allowed to place the products on the market. So you have this mix of two types of legislation, which is a bit challenging also for the lawyers, because IT lawyers, except for maybe the radio equipment directive, or every now and then the machinery directive or regulation now, do not really come into contact with that product legislation, except if they are specialized in, for example, medical devices or do specific compliance work. But that's usually not IT lawyers. This is also a difficult one, of course, for people like you who are more on the engineering side, where you will have to look at it immediately from two different perspectives, and then also from your perspective as a person in practice. To understand product legislation, you have the European Commission Blue Guide. You probably already know this one. So specific concepts in product legislation are further explained in there. Of course, the Blue Guide only goes so far. The document is from before the CRA. It's from before the AI Act. It has some gaps where you do not really know how to apply the new legislation in some cases, because the Blue Guide doesn't give you guidance, and you have to wait for further guidance from the Commission. Any questions so far? Because now I will go into the specific products. Okay. So first element of relevance for the CRA is, of course, the products with digital elements. It is what decides the scope. If you look at the definition is actually quite vague, because the definition of products with digital elements explains to you it applies to software, hardware, it applies to remote data processing solution and components. And all of those elements are then also defined specifically again in the CRA. But to actually understand what a product with digital elements is, you have to go one article back, where they look at the material scope and say that it needs to be hardware or software that specifically does data processing. So it needs a data connection, which can be direct, indirect, logical, or physical, and that connection is then to a device or a network. So various options, and then it needs to be made available on the market. Making available on the market, you can find this again in the Blue Guide. But important here to know is the data connection. Of course, we make the link again with cybersecurity, because cybersecurity, one of the main goals of cybersecurity is to protect the data. Then looking at the other concepts, we have the components. Components seem to be clear until you start applying them to practice, because you actually have many types of components as a manufacturer. A manufacturer will look at the component and will see components from outside the European Union, which might have no CE marking, components that it can buy from before the CRA entered into force, from after the CRA entered into force, and also free and open source components. We will see in a minute when we go through some examples what specific issues there might be. And then you have remote data processing solutions. This is an add-on that you add to your product with digital elements that adds functionality to it, meaning that if it's not there, it takes away functionality from the product with digital elements. It's quite a vague concept, because it means that it's remote, it's outside the product with digital elements. When applying it in practice, you might see links with, as a legal professional, but maybe also you as engineers, with, for example, the Data Act, where you have your connected product and related service. The related service under the Data Act has very similar wording to the remote data processing solution in the CRA, which leads to a bit of confusion because here the remote data processing solution, for example, will always be from the same manufacturer as the product to digital elements itself, but under the Data Act, the manufacturer will be who can be a different person. Like for example, if you have a smartwatch, like Garmin, and you connect it to Garmin Connect, you can change settings on your smartwatch via Garmin Connect. That will be likely a remote data processing solution. But then if you have Strava, it will not be a remote data processing solution because it's from a third manufacturer, but it will be, for example, a related service under the Data Act. So the fact that these legislations overlap to a certain extent, but then also have a slightly different scope, makes it quite difficult for companies trying to apply the CRA and or the Data Act, which means that it's due to the entry into application that is more or less the same. Say that being said, it's 2 years apart. Companies should likely look at the scope of both pieces of legislation at the same time. So now we'll go into some practical views where we will first zoom in and then we will zoom out. Zooming in means we will look at how to apply the CRA to a specific product to digital elements, while zooming out means we will look at the broader picture. So zooming in first, when we talk to engineers, for example, they will always come to us having looked at the annexes of the CRA, where you have your essential requirements, and they will say, look, we have these and these requirements fulfilled. These we do not have, but we are working on them. Are we okay? That's one of the big issues we have nowadays because some companies are already working on CRA implementation, but they start from the implementation phase and never start with what we call the fact-finding phase. But how we look at it in practice is actually you need to start from a fact-finding phase, meaning you start to look at how does it apply, meaning you start from what products are in scope, who are the stakeholders involved, how is the product commercialized. Those are always the 3 elements that you will need as a minimum. And only then can you start the qualification, which means staging. And then once everything is qualified, you can go into the implementation because you know what is in scope and how do I apply it. And that's actually one of the big problems that we see today, that indeed companies start with the implementation phase, but ignore the earlier steps. And then, of course, you have maintenance where documents need to be reviewed, but also where you will have to handle, for example, vulnerabilities that come up and stuff like that. And that's, of course, an important part under the CRA. From a legal perspective, when talking to lawyers, the main added value will be in the first 2 steps, which is likely also why I find them so important. And then also probably in the maintenance phase where you have a reporting obligation, where you need to, for example, make a qualification of a significant incident, and you will need, or you might need a lawyer to have a look at it to state whether it's significant or not, and whether or not it's reportable or not, like it also happens nowadays under the GDPR. So when applying the CRA in practice, we always make a team. The team is compiled mainly from a legal, a business, and a compliance part, and then also a technical part. And those roles, of course, in some businesses are mixed, because legal and compliance might be together. Business and technical might also be together, depending on how big your company is. But you need to have a view on all these things because, as I mentioned earlier, you really need to know what products are relevant, who are the stakeholders involved, so where does your product come from, where is it going, and also how is it commercialized. So the core team will consist of profiles who have experience with these elements. So applying it to practice, this is an example from a use case that we had in our European ECCC funded project, where we have a managed service provider who provides a SASE solution, so a secure access service edge, I think it is, meaning that you have some services that you provide as an MSP, including software, including hardware, where you manage the security of a customer. So they have a customer company, which it's a very small business. It has, for example, a laptop and a printer, and then you apply the SASE solution to the laptop and the printer, meaning that you will be adding, for example, to the laptop, you will install some software on it, and then to the printer, you will add a dongle. And that then all connects to a server, which is stored at the MSP, and then the MSP manages the cloud for the client. So immediately when you start looking at this from a CRA perspective, you have a lot of complications because some things are components, some things might be products or digital elements on their own, some might be from the MSP itself, some might be from third parties. Like, for example, if you look at the dongle, this might be a dongle that is imported from another country, might be a Chinese dongle that is imported in the European Union. And then the MSP might, for example, put a sticker with their name on there. Then if you have the software might be open source software, might be software that they changed, might be software that they developed in-house, depending. It might have components that need to be further clarified. So depending on how all of this is organized, the analysis will be completely different because you need to know where the responsibility is, who has the responsibility. And also, of course, this is important because you need to know how and where you can market it. Then this is more complex, of course, because you also have your cloud element. The cloud element, is it a remote data processing solution under the CRA, or is it just a cloud service that falls under NIS2? It adds more complexity to this. So looking at it from, for example, the server, when you try to apply the CRA, you have to know what components are in your product to digital elements. So a server, of course, consists of various elements, both hardware, software. If you don't know these, if you don't know where these come from, you have not done your job as a manufacturer. You have, if you, for example, if the company in this case would be developing this server themselves, would be adding components from everywhere in the world into that server, they have a due diligence obligation and need to ensure that the product itself, so the final product, complies with the CRA. For that, of course, they need to know what products are in there, and that's already a big issue in practice because we notice that many companies have insufficient information on their own products, both from a hardware and a software perspective. And then we also look at, for example, the software. So you have the hardware components, but you have also the software components, and then the software components typically also fall apart into other components, where you have your in-house components in the software. Those are clear. You have your due diligence obligation, but you developed it yourself, so you should know what is in there. Of course, cybersecurity is not always a priority for companies, so they might not have developed it with the idea of cybersecurity. You have third-party components. Third-party components are quite complex in practice because you have your components that are CE marked. Those are clear. You know where they come from. You have components that come from a third party outside the European Union. Well, they might be imported. They might not be imported. Who is the importer? Who is the manufacturer? All those things you need to know, of course. And then you have, of course, components that predate the CRA. So when you try to apply the CRA in the very beginning, you will have potentially the issue that you do not know whether or how the component helps you with complying with your cyber resilience requirements. And then when looking specifically at free and open source software, I have two on the slides, but actually there are more types of free and open source components. First of all, you have the free and open source components that are made available on the market. That's what the abbreviation stands for. So making available on the market means that it's commercialized, it's monetized by a party providing you the free and open source software. Then you have free and open source software that is not made available on the market. Here you have a few options. So you have the one that is not monetized or does not have the intention to be monetized, but you also have the one that open source stewards are managing. And there you have, again, the distinction where there might be a voluntary attestation that the software complies, but it also might not have it. So as a manufacturer, it quickly falls apart where you start to apply it to all your components. You need to know them, but then you also need to know where they come from and how they add to your cybersecurity. Adding to this, of course, you also have the fact that the due diligence obligation is not super clearly set out, meaning that you do not know to which standard you need to comply with the CRA, or that your components need to help you comply with the CRA in the product with digital elements. So then zooming out a bit, when you start applying the CRA, we saw it already in one of the first slides. You have this whole waterfall where you see that the CRA, of course, does not exist in a vacuum, meaning that many other types of legislation exist. So in this case, you have, for example, your a smart grid where it makes a connection via software to the cloud, and then you can manage some things via your phone, which of course has an application. To most of these things, or likely all of them, the CRA will apply to one extent or another. But then when trying to get the full legal picture, of course, you have a lot more, because when talking about cloud, you will also have to think about, for example, NIS2, where the NIS2 directive applies to cloud, to providers of cloud services, depending on their size. You also have, of course, the GDPR, where personal data will be processed. Today, you also have the Data Act, well, starting from 12 September, where users of the service, then specifically in the context of cloud, have the right to change to another service. And then if AI is let loose on the data, of course, you also have AI considerations in there. When looking then at the hardware, you have, of course, again, potential application of NIS2, you have the Radio Equipment Directive, GDPR Data Act, and then also just general product safety that you need to take into consideration. And then the same is true for the software, where you would have to think about the various types of legislation. So this was, in a nutshell, how we from the legal side look at it. I think we can have some questions now, because I guess I saw a lot of these things popping up in the chat. I'll just open the questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pedro. This was incredibly insightful, really helpful to get like that, again, very different perspective, a different worldview. There is a few questions. I think the first one was quite specific, was by Alistair. When you mentioned this watch example and the difference between CRA remote data processing and the Data Act, what do you call it?
Related service.
Related service, thank you. And I think Alistair was asking, was saying this is a wonderful example. Do the watch manufacturers have to control their APIs? And I'm not exactly sure where he was going with this, and maybe Alistair, if you want to jump in
So
terms of like,
I was on a European call, possibly a year ago now, when they give the update of the verticals. And I very expressly asked the question about, is the problem from a set theory perspective, do you need to worry about the union, the intersection of things, or as an exclusion of stuff? And I used a very similar example of the fact that if you imagine a Garmin watch, it can possibly have heart monitoring or blood rate detection features. And if somebody like some application like Strava wants to get access to that data, is it the responsibility of the OS manufacturer, which I'm assuming is Garmin, to regulate access to that so that the user is aware that that data is being probed, or is it not? And I got a very unsatisfactory answer at the time about the fact that it wasn't the watch manufacturer's responsibility in any way, shape, or form, which I believed to be inappropriate or misunderstanding of what I would expect the European Commission to care about. So I don't want to rattle on this topic, but I think it's an interesting corner case. And I'm happy to take comments offline or on the thread as you wish.
So you are then looking at it also from the data act perspective, if I understand correctly.
Well, I think that the interesting challenge is one needs to look at it from all of the acts. And then the question is, does from the CRA perspective, the watch manufacturer's OS is within scope? I would hope that they need to regulate their API. They can't just go, well, it's not on us. We didn't write the app. We don't care, right? That looks like a data breach waiting to happen, as far as I'm concerned.
So the data act specifically starts from the position of the user who asks, but then of course the manufacturer has the obligation to share the data in a way that is secure. So I think the answer is easy. Yes, they are obligated to ensure that the data is shared in a secure way. But then the data will never be shared with, for example, Strava without the user knowing it. The user will take an active step to share it. So,
and if
at least
they
in the case of Strava.
And if they don't, if there is a bug in that thing, then the Garmin in this case would be liable under the CRA.
Yes, probably yes, because the API connection is of course relevant to the working of the product.
Okay, but you don't sound too sure.
Well, I'm just thinking because the API connection it might be considered software as such under the CRA, but is it sufficient? I've never applied the CRA to an API connection as such. It's an interesting question.
I mean, I guess if there's data leaked to a third party, that's essentially an exploited bug, right?
Yes,
so I would
but
assume
it's not an issue with the watch necessarily.
Well, it depends where the data. I mean, what part of
It's
the product,
likely going
like where
to
the
the
data was
clouds, and
leaked.
then
Right, but this is my point. If the watch shouldn't allow Strava to get access to my heart rate information, there is a hardware sensor on the device that if I, as the consumer, say I don't want that application, in this case Strava, to get access to that data, then it shouldn't be able to get the data off the watch. It shouldn't even go to the cloud.
Well, as a lawyer, I would suggest tackling this from a GDPR perspective, and then maybe have fun with the Data Act and CRA, like subsidiarily, but I don't think it's a very clear case, depending on how, of course, the data is leaked. Because if it comes from the application might be the issue. If it comes from the watch might be the issue. But if it's uploaded to the cloud and then there is an API connection, the API is an additional service. And then
no. I'm thinking of an API on the watch where the Strava. Anyway, the sound. So I will continue to poke at this question whenever I run it because it's clear, and I'm happy to draw some slides about which API, whether it's on the watch or whatever it is, and get into a conversation. But the fact that this class of things doesn't seem to be well understood and would be a good area to get some clarification on. So I'll put a say. Let's stop and get out of the rat hole.
Thank you, Alistair. I think part of the confusion comes with the use of the term API that might be confusing to folks who are less technical and imagine API as typically a cloud-based thing, whereas I believe you were talking about it more in terms of like interconnected software on the same device. And so maybe using a different term for this and making sure that that term is clarified might help you get more clarity. Just a suggestion and a thought. I think we can move on to some other question. There was a comment by Danielle about RED expiring in 2027. I don't know like how public this information is, but also I'm not sure it changes much in the next couple of years.
The idea of the CRA is that the radio equipment directive is there until the CRA comes into application. So until the radio equipment directive comes into application, the CRA comes into application, you have these requirements already to a certain extent in the radio equipment directive. But I also don't know if it changes a lot in practice because, yeah, I haven't had the question yet in practice.
Ole?
Yeah, I think we're talking about the RED Delegated Act, not the full RED.
Yes.
The Delegated Act adds cybersecurity requirements, and those cybersecurity requirements will be replaced by the Cyber Resilience Act. So if you're preparing now for the RED Delegated Act, which comes into action, you need to take Cyber Resilience Act into that work as well. But is the full RED with all the radio requirements won't be replaced by CRA, only the cybersecurity requirements.
Yes.
Thank you.
That's helpful, Ole. Thank you. I'm seeing a lot of comments, but not many questions. I actually, until people come up with more questions, I had a question for you. You have this diagram of sort of like the 4 different steps, and you kind of glossed over it because this is obvious to you. Yes, this. Can you go over the ones that lawyers do before engineers get involved in a bit more depth? Because I think it was really interesting. I don't even understand what you mean by staging. Fact finding, I believe you described as understanding who the stakeholders are, understanding like what's in scope, and then understanding like how you actually placing things on the market, or then how do you move to staging, and like is there more to fact finding than this, and why are these steps important?
So a lawyer will typically look at a law from 2 perspectives, like looking from a step back. It will look at the material scope, territorial scope, personal scope. Material scope being to what does it apply, personal scope to who does it apply, and then territorial scope in which locations does it apply. And all those things you need to know, of course, before a applying the CRA as well, because you will have your product to digital elements, but you need to see whether the product that you are assessing or the list of products that you are assessing actually falls within the material scope. So does it have the data processing component? Is it able to send the data out? All those things, but then more from a legal than really a technical perspective, because you need to fit the definition of the Data Act. Then the personal scope will be really looking at who is the manufacturer. Are there components? Where do the components come from? Also, how is it commercialized? Meaning that you will look at other importers, distributors, authorized representatives. It also includes a look at other product legislation, because that usually gives you already a good baseline to understand how the product works. Also from a legal perspective, because if, like for example, the radio equipment directive already applies, and you already have like the baseline structure, it also helps because the company already has a compliance process in place, because they already know what a declaration of conformity is and stuff like that, which might be an issue under the CRA because it's quite broad. So many companies who are not aware of product legislation will fall under it. And then you have, of course, also the territorial scope, meaning that you have to look at the concepts of placing on the market and making available. And those are really the three elements that you need to start the staging phase, because the staging is then really applying the law. The first one is gathering the facts. You need to know what is there. And then the staging phase is applying the law to it and then putting everything into its correct box. And that's, of course, what is necessary to then start with the implementation. Is that clear?
It's really helpful. When you mean applying the law, this is like literally gathering like the kind of steps that will be taken internally and externally to meet the requirements and the broader requirements and the obligations, etc., right?
Yes. So you put it in the box, meaning you also look at the annexes, like for example, saying it's an important or critical product to digital elements, which means that you can also do the implementation phase a bit more efficiently. So yes.
And sort of like following on this question, when do you look in general with your clients at the existence of standards, and how do you leverage them? Like, is this part of like the implementation process? You go look for like, you look at standards as a way to ease implementation, or how do you think of them, and how do your clients think of them in general?
So to be honest, many clients are really just stuck at the first two phases. They are already mapping what they have just in case for the implementation phase. They have like a vague view on what they need to do, but they are not yet considering anything like standards and stuff like that with their implementation. But also important to notice, the standards, the implementation will generally be done by a technical partner. For that, the lawyers are a bit less involved. That's also why I put the red box. But that's generally where they would be starting to look at it. Of course, we tell them about it because you have the presumptions of conformity, but in the end, it's they with a technical partner who will be looking at it.
Right. So from your perspective, it's quite current that a client of yours might already be doing compliance for related legislation and be looking at this more in terms of like, what's my gap? And what are the pieces that I need to fill, rather than from a process that they would start from scratch.
Yes, so they really look at the annexes with essential requirements as a checklist, also without necessarily understanding what is required under each step, and then just go over it requirement by requirement. And then some things they go really deep in because they have the technical expertise. Other things They just make a document that has the minimum requirements according to them, and that's it. But yeah, it's a main issue today that we see that clients start with the implementation phase without really looking back first at how the CRA applies to them or whether it does not apply to them. When clients come to us for the first two phases, it's generally because they ask, can we make it not apply to us? And not necessarily because they are already applying it.
Yeah, I had a quick follow-up question on this, and then I want to go to Salvi, who has an interesting question about stewards in the chat. My follow-up question was, do you see clients, or do you have clients to just this point that you made, that are looking at, oh, maybe they need to change a bit how they sell something, or sort of like modify their products or their services so that they're not in scope? I mean, is this something that you see or that you expect to see?
It's a trend already that more and more services or softwares are just offered as a service. So from that perspective, you might escape, but of course, you quickly you fall in scope when you have a hardware component or a hardware product to digital elements to which the cloud connects. But yeah, no, in general, I don't think it's really possible to change your product too much to not fall in scope. What I do notice more and more is that cybersecurity is what the commission actually intended, becoming like a selling factor. In the beginning, I myself was a bit skeptic because I looked at it and I was like, is this really important to consumers? Will consumers consider this? For consumers, I think it's still quite fake. They don't really look at the cybersecurity as some added factor or an added benefit. But then when you look at more the B2B context, cybersecurity is becoming important also because the business is falling under NIS2. They want to use the CE label on their product to digital elements to show that they comply with NIS2 as well.
Very interesting. So you're already seeing some of the intention of the commission of essentially having more focused on cybersecurity materializing, especially in the B2B space.
Yeah.
Okay, well that's really interesting. So now jumping to Salve. Salve is asking if you could share your thoughts on what are some reasonable expectations that you would have, that a manufacturer would have of an open source software stewards, and kind of like what would be useful roles for manufacturers to have. I mean, what would be useful roles for stewards to have from the manufacturer's perspective?
So open source will, I think, mainly be used as a component. So when looking at that, it's the due diligence obligation that is relevant. Due diligence obligation is quite vague. We don't know how it should be interpreted. It probably will also depend on the specific product to digital elements you're assessing. Depending on which product to digital elements, of course, the requirements will also be heavier. And I think from a manufacturer perspective, they want to be unburdened as much as possible. So if you have the attestation that the product or the component actually helps with compliance, I think a manufacturer will be euphoric that they don't have to do the assessment themselves. So I think it's really like trust. So having a curated free and open source software that they can rely on and ensure that their due diligence obligation is made lighter. That would be my point of view, at least.
Yeah, you mentioned the due diligence requirements often. It's also one of the areas that I'm very interested in. Yeah, I agree with you. It is a one-liner in the whole of the CRA, which is a very big text, which essentially says when you integrate third-party components, you have to do due diligence and make sure that they don't what's the right word? make the security of your component less than it would have been otherwise? Something like this. I'm not exactly sure how they mention this. But that's I agree. Especially in software, it's a particular important aspect. One of the other things on that topic that you mentioned is on the CE mark, and you sort of seem to be working with the assumption that if something has a CE mark, then your due diligence obligations are essentially limited to making sure it's the right product for the integration and integrating it properly. Is that sort of like your perspective, and is that sort of like a shared understanding in the legal world?
It is the point of view that I would take from a practical perspective as a manufacturer, because you have your due diligence obligation if you integrate it as a component, and then also for your NIS2 compliance, you need to, of course, check your suppliers to a certain extent. So the CE marking today for all your products that have them gives you like the trust, the security that you will have a product that complies as a baseline with certain requirements, so you can build further on those. If manufacturer would not be able to rely on the CE marking on a component or on a product, then the value of the CE marking would actually be lost to me. I would say yes.
Very
Of course,
interesting. So yeah, so you kind
yeah,
of see this as a self-defining thing, right? If it doesn't do this, it's meaningless, so it has to do it.
yes, that's the position I would take. Of course, if you need to know this, you need to know the CRA. If it has gaps, then you need to know how to fill those gaps. But yeah, at least you will have the documentation ready to check because it's required under the CRA to have those as a manufacturer. So you can ask your supplier for the documentation if you don't trust the product.
Kieran. Oh,
Oh.
I thought this was your family's your kids wanting also to ask a question to Pedro, but I don't think that was the case. Spies, okay. We'll definitely cut that bit of the presentation. So you also mentioned attestations quite a few times, and I was kind of led to understand, and I think I talk about them in some of our documents on GitHub, as the equivalent of the CE mark, but for open source components. And you also seem to believe that they would be very useful for manufacturers to be able to more easily leverage open source components. I think you said that they would make them euphoric, which everyone wants to make their manufacturers euphoric for sure. That's also a very undefined area of the CRA, and so I'm wondering, like, if you have also more thoughts to share on this.
It's I think it's also indeed quite undefined. There needs to be further guidance on what the security attestation will involve, because of course you don't have a well-defined process like you have for the CE marking itself. So I suppose it will be less because they want to support innovation from a policy standpoint. So making it too burdensome will mean that no one will do it. If you, as a manufacturer, will be using something that is subject to security attestation, you will have parts of your puzzle for the due diligence obligation, but it will really depend on how it's implemented in practice to see what the value will be. I think from a cybersecurity perspective, it will be less, the baseline will be lower, but it will still be like a good starting point for your due diligence obligation, which you may have to add on depending on how the security attestation is implemented.
Do you have experience or knowledge of other similar sort of programs in the EU that this is sort of mapped upon?
The security attestation,
Yeah.
not really.
Okay, interesting. So this is not only new for for our side of the world.
I think they made it specifically for the CRA because in product legislation, it's usually doesn't apply to software. Under the medical devices regulation, it does to a certain extent. Under the AI Act, to a certain extent. In the AI Act, it's more as a service, and then now the CRA, and then open source is is an important part here. And then they really wanted to protect innovation, so they are just inventing new stuff, as far as I know, just to ensure that there is something, but that it's not too hard to not hinder any new things coming out in the EU, because that's of course a main concern today of the EU.
All right, so that's a very interesting and very enlightening way to actually end this conversation. Sadly, because this is a too good question to not spend the last 2 minutes on. Danielle is asking, can presumption of conformity or can CE mark help and protect from liability under the PLD? Like, what's the interplay between these two things, the PLD and the CRA? And can compliance help you protect yourself from the PLD side?
So yes, but no, because your presumption, the presumption of conformity will allow you to prove that you have done what is necessary. But if harm occurs to a user using your products, you will still be liable as a manufacturer. It might just be, yes, correct, no fault liability. You will still have the obligation to provide recompense even if something happens. But if it goes to court, for example, you will show, look, I have done what is necessary, and this was an issue that I didn't know. So yeah, know about. Of course, you could always try to invoke force majeure, but in a product liability, it's difficult. A drink, good. Glad I could help.
All right. Well, on this nice note, I think we're going to close this great conversation. Thank you again for joining us, Pedro, today, and for not only sharing your views but also answering our trick questions. And
They were
this
interesting.
was really
Thank you.
helpful. Any sort of like place where people can get a reach of you or learn about the work that you do.
Just add me on LinkedIn. I try to put interesting stuff there every now and then, or when I speak at an event. So
All right,
feel free to add
wonderful.
me.
Well, people, you know where to reach Pedro. Thank you again for joining us, and we will be sharing the recording of this call and your slides on our GitHub as soon as they're ready. And this was this closes this first series of CRA Mondays. I think we'll take a bit of a break during the summer and see how we organize ourselves back as September and the second part of the year reaches out. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.